The apartment was perfect. At least, that's what I told myself, clinging to optimism as I unpacked the last of my moving boxes. The hardwood floors gleamed under the harsh fluorescence, and the pale beige walls radiated an eerie stillness. Yet from the moment I moved in, there was an undeniable presence, a heavy, unsettling feeling that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. The first night, as I lay on my mattress surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, I heard it, the distinct sound of footsteps coming from the unit above. The plodding, irregular cadence echoed through the ceiling, followed by a dull, heavy dragging noise. A chill ran down my spine, and my heart raced. I knew the floor above was supposed to be under renovation. The landlord himself had assured me it was vacant. Trying to rationalize the sound, I muttered that it must be a maintenance worker or some late-night renovations. But the unease lingered. The next day, I stopped by the leasing office to ask about the activity upstairs. The receptionist looked confused. "Nobody's been in there for months," she said, her words punctuated by a nervous smile. Her uncertainty didn't reassure me. If anything, it made the silence around me feel thicker. That evening, as darkness swallowed the last traces of daylight, the footsteps resumed. This time, they were louder, more purposeful. I held my breath, pressing my ear against the cold plaster. Was I imagining it? It felt like someone was pacing, but no, that couldn't be right. My landlord's words played on repeat in my mind. No tenants upstairs. Yet, as the muffled thuds morphed into a scraping noise, my stomach twisted into tight, anxious knots. Every rational thought I had wrestled with the sheer, irrational terror rising within me. Days passed. Every night, the disturbances grew more aggressive. Sometimes it sounded like multiple people, whispering just low enough to be indecipherable, but loud enough to taunt my sanity. The worst was the dragging. It was a wet, visceral sound that made my skin crawl, as if something heavy, something unclean was being moved across the floor. One evening, desperate to quiet the noise, I banged on the ceiling with a broom. Everything went silent. The tension in the air was palpable, like a taut wire ready to snap. Then a single, deliberate knock answered my own, directly above where I stood. Fear constricted my throat, and I stumbled back, my knees almost buckling. That night, I barely slept, too terrified to close my eyes, haunted by the feeling that something was observing me, waiting. The final straw came when I discovered the notice in the building's basement. Yellowed and barely clinging to a corkboard, it announced that the entire top floor had been condemned for structural issues years ago. My breath caught, and the room spun. If no one was allowed up there, then who, or what, was pacing above me every night? That evening, driven by desperation, I convinced myself I needed to see the unit above for myself. Climbing the stairs, each creaking under my hesitant steps, I reached the door. The lock had been rusted shut, an ancient padlock dangling uselessly. But it was the scratch marks on the doorframe, long and deep, that made my heart stutter. Fingers trembling, I turned to leave. Behind me, the door to the condemned apartment creaked open an inch on its own, and for a second I thought I heard it, a low, rasping whisper that sent me running back down the stairs, refusing to ever look back. The National Park brochure painted a picture of serenity. Endless trees swaying under a soft breeze, crystal clear streams meandering through valleys, and trails waiting for exploration. That's what drew me in, that illusion of calm. I hiked deep off the beaten path, setting up my tent far away from any other camper. The isolation felt freeing until it didn't. By nightfall, a heavy stillness blanketed the woods. My campfire sputtered, casting long, twisting shadows around me. I couldn't help but notice how the trees seemed closer, as if leaning in to eavesdrop on my every move. I tried to distract myself by staring at the stars, but my focus kept breaking. Every few minutes, there was a rustle, a shift in the underbrush, a crack of a twig. Wildlife, I told myself, even as unease slithered through my gut. I wrapped my sleeping bag tighter around me, trying to ignore the feeling that eyes were peering through the darkness. Sometime after midnight, the first true sign of trouble appeared. carvings in the dirt outside my tent, right where I had been sitting. Names, dates, fresh enough that the soil was still disturbed, crumbs of earth scattered about. My stomach lurched as I realized the most recent date was yesterday's. Trembling, I swept the dirt smooth, telling myself I had just missed it earlier. Maybe some harmless prank by hikers. But the dread was harder to ignore when I found another marking on the trunk of a nearby tree. An arrow, pointing deeper into the forest, the wood freshly gashed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was trying to lead me somewhere, away from camp, away from safety. Sleep didn't come easily. Every slight noise jerked me awake. Around 3 a.m., I heard them. Footsteps circling my tent. Slow, purposeful, crunching leaves and snapping twigs moving in tight, steady circles. My pulse hammered so loudly I thought it might echo through the night. Clutching my hunting knife, I listened, each step bringing a suffocating sense of dread. Whoever or whatever, it knew exactly where I was. The footsteps halted, replaced by silence that felt far too intentional. I didn't dare unzip the tent. I held my breath, ears straining. The pause stretched on, becoming its own entity, a weight pressing down on my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. Then, something slid against the fabric of my tent, a gentle scraping that sent a spike of panic through my limbs. I couldn't stay. Grabbing my flashlight, I forced myself to unzip the tent and stumble out, knife still gripped tight. The forest swallowed me whole, and my flashlight barely pierced the darkness. Shadows danced and twisted as I swept the beam around, desperate to find the intruder. Nothing. No person, no creature. Just an unnatural, waiting stillness. Turning back to the campsite, I froze. More carvings, larger and clearer this time, gouged into the dirt around the dying embers of my fire. You're not leaving alone. My vision blurred, and cold sweat slicked my palms. I spun in place, sure I'd see someone standing in the shadows, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. But I was alone, visibly at least. I didn't pack up. I grabbed what I could and stumbled into the woods, trying to find the trail. But every path I thought I knew seemed different now, twisted in on itself. The trees all looked the same, and panic clawed at my mind. The deeper I ran, the more the forest seemed to close in around me, like a labyrinth with no exit. Then I saw them, symbols carved into the trees, circling me, appearing on every side, no matter which direction I turned. Whispers drifted through the air, words I couldn't quite make out. I pressed my back to a tree, knife raised, but it felt useless, pathetic against whatever had drawn me into this nightmare. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Time had lost meaning. Dawn broke slowly, a pale light filtering through the trees. Only then did the whispers fade, and the symbols seemed to vanish, as if daylight erased whatever terror lurked there. Stumbling out of the woods, I found myself at a ranger station, wild-eyed and shaking. They told me no one else had gone missing recently. But as I left, I overheard one of the rangers whisper to another, mentioning that hikers occasionally found carvings in those woods, dates that never seemed to match the timeline of the living. I never camped alone again. The symbols and whispers followed me in dreams, though, and I always felt that the forest had let me go only temporarily, still waiting for me to come back. From the outside, the house seemed like a steal. A colonial fixer-upper with good bones and a massive front porch that sagged only slightly under the weight of years. My partner, Emma, and I had dreams of renovating it, making it our masterpiece before flipping it for a tidy profit. But stepping inside for the first time felt like stepping into a different world, one thick with stale air and something unspoken lingering in the shadows. The first few days were uneventful, filled with tearing up old carpeting and making plans to knock down walls. It wasn't until we started serious demolition that the unease set in. Emma was tearing out drywall when she called me over, her face pale under a film of dust. She had found a hidden space between the walls, and the sight inside made my stomach turn. It was a small alcove lined with old newspapers, all yellowed with age, and on them were smudged, bloody handprints. I laughed it off, a joke I insisted some bored teenager playing a prank decades ago. We moved on. We had to. The house wouldn't flip itself, after all. But soon we started finding more disturbing relics. Beneath a section of floorboards that we pried open in the living room, there were dark, splattered stains that had seeped deep into the wood, almost like something had been violently spilled there. The color made my stomach twist. It looked too dark, too real to just be old paint. Emma didn't say anything, but her silence was louder than any argument. The strangest discovery came from an upstairs bedroom closet. We were pulling out shelves to make space for modern storage when Emma's crowbar snagged something behind the wall. Peeling away the wooden planks, we found a small door, a crawl space that neither of us had noticed before. When we pried it open, the stale smell was almost overpowering, a damp, sour odor that made my eyes water. Inside, we found deep, claw-like scratches etched into the wall, as if someone, or something, had tried desperately to escape. But it was the note that made my skin crawl. Crumpled in one corner, written in a trembling hand, it read, "Please don't find me." That night, I couldn't sleep. The house creaked and settled, as old houses do, but each sound felt too deliberate, too alive. Emma tried to calm my nerves, but I could tell she was just as unsettled. Every time I drifted off, I was jolted awake by dreams of someone whispering from within the walls, of hands pushing desperately against the old, splintered wood. The following day, Emma and I decided to push through. We had a timeline and budget to keep. I worked on gutting the kitchen while she focused on the upstairs bedrooms. Midway through knocking out a rotting beam, I heard it, Emma's scream, raw and piercing. Dropping everything, I sprinted up the stairs 2 at a time, my heart slamming in my chest. Emma was standing in the master bedroom, staring at the far wall. Her hands were trembling, the hammer clutched so tightly her knuckles were white. She pointed, and at first I didn't see it. But then I did. Words barely visible under layers of ancient, peeling wallpaper. "He watches." The implication clawed at my brain, and suddenly every inch of that house felt suffocating. It was as if the walls themselves had eyes, observing us as we pried open its secrets. We should have left then, but stubbornness and the promise of profit kept us going. We convinced ourselves it was all explainable, though we never said that aloud. Our fear became something tangible, wedging itself between us and a house that felt increasingly hostile. The final blow came when we hired a plumber to update the rusted pipes. As he was working in the basement, he called us over, visibly shaken. "You've got to see this," he said, voice tight with disbelief. He had found a brick wall behind the boiler, clearly built hastily and unevenly. We helped him knock it down, revealing a small, hidden room. The space was empty except for a single chair bolted to the floor and a heavy chain lying slack next to it. Scratched into the cement walls, a phrase had been repeated over and over until the words were nearly unreadable. "Let me go. Let me go. Let me go." A chill washed over me, leaving me breathless, as if the walls themselves were whispering the desperate pleas. We never finished the renovation. We packed up and left, abandoning our investment and our dreams for good. Sometimes I wonder if the house still waits, breathing quietly in the dark, holding on to its secrets. And I wonder if one day it will find someone new to dig them up again. It was the first time in months that my phone had buzzed with such urgency, and when I picked it up, Jason's name was flashing on the screen. His voice trembled, and I could hear wind whipping in the background. "They're following me," he managed to say before the line cut out. I stared at the phone in disbelief, my brain struggling to process the terror in his voice. I tried calling him back, but it went straight to voicemail. Over and over, I called, feeling my pulse drum louder with each unanswered ring. Panic set in as the minutes dragged on, the silence of my apartment pressing in on me. Jason was one of my oldest friends, dependable and steady, not the kind of guy to make prank calls or vanish without a reason. Something was wrong, very wrong. The police were indifferent, shrugging off my concerns as if a grown man going missing was just another Tuesday. They chalked it up to a possible misunderstanding or an argument he didn't want to discuss. Their blasé attitude only fueled my anxiety. The idea that Jason could be in danger and no one was doing a thing about it gnawed at me. A few days later, the first text came. Jason's number lit up my screen, and for a brief, foolish moment, relief washed over me. But as I read the message, my hands grew clammy. Remember the boardwalk? The one with the Ferris wheel? Meet me there. A photo followed, grainy and too dark, but unmistakably the boardwalk where Jason and I had spent countless summer nights. I rushed there, hoping against all logic to find him waiting. Instead, the boardwalk was eerily deserted, the Ferris wheel's lights flickering in the distance. The place had always been lively and full of laughter, but that night it felt hollow, haunted. My breath fogged in the cool air as I wandered, searching for any sign of him. Nothing. No Jason. Only shadows and the faint whisper of waves crashing against the shore. More texts followed, each one drawing me back into our shared past. Places we'd hung out, trails we'd hiked, the diner where we'd spent late nights over bad coffee. Each destination was empty, abandoned. It was as if someone or something was playing a twisted game, dragging me through our old memories. The deeper I sank into the mystery, the more the world around me felt distorted, like a dream slipping into a nightmare. One night, exhausted and unraveling, I received another message. Last spot. You know the one. My chest tightened. I knew immediately where it was. Our high school, where Jason and I had spent hours on the track, talking about everything and nothing. The field had become overgrown in the years since we graduated, the bleachers rusted and creaking in the wind. My hands shook as I approached, flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. The field was empty, or so I thought. As I turned to leave, my flashlight caught something, a figure standing near the bleachers. Heart pounding, I stumbled forward, only to realize it wasn't Jason. The person was dressed in dark clothing, head bowed. They lifted their face slowly, and though the features were obscured, a chilling familiarity gripped me. This person knew me. Somehow, they knew everything. Before I could react, another text came. Turn around. I whipped around, my pulse roaring in my ears. But there was no one behind me. The feeling of being watched settled heavily on my shoulders, like an invisible hand pressing down on my spine. I turned back to where the stranger had stood, but they were gone. Only an envelope lay on the ground, half buried in the tall grass. With trembling fingers, I opened it. Inside was a photograph of Jason and me, taken years ago on that very field. But there was something wrong. In the picture, Jason was looking over his shoulder, eyes wide with terror, as if something had been closing in on him. Written on the back, in handwriting that almost looked like Jason's, were the words, "You missed it." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound felt amplified, each shadow in my apartment brimming with secrets. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching, that this game was far from over. Jason never surfaced, not even a hint of his whereabouts. It was as if he had been swallowed by the places we'd once cherished, leaving me to wander in a fog of unanswered questions. Sometimes I receive texts from his number still. They never make sense, fragments of conversations we had long ago, as if whoever or whatever has his phone wants me to believe he's out there. But deep down, I know he's gone. Or maybe I'm the one being pulled into that same void, step by step, following a trail that only leads further into the unknown. I was strapped for cash, and the house-sitting gig seemed perfect. It paid ridiculously well, and the family was only gone for a week. The mansion itself sat isolated at the end of a long, winding driveway, surrounded by woods that seemed to press in from all sides. The house loomed large and beautiful, yet somehow too still, as if holding its breath. They left me a detailed list of instructions. Strict instructions. The fridge was stocked, and I could use the pool, the theater room, whatever I liked. But I wasn't to enter the West Wing, where important belongings were stored. I figured that was fair enough. Every time I passed the heavy, locked door leading to that part of the house, though, an inexplicable tension gripped me. The first night passed uneventfully. The only sounds the hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of the old wood floors. I almost convinced myself it was going to be an easy gig. But by the second night, things started to change. I was in the kitchen making a sandwich when I felt it. That unmistakable sensation of being watched. It was subtle at first, the kind of feeling you can rationalize away. But then it grew, heavy and oppressive, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I turned sharply, expecting to catch someone, or something, watching me. Nothing. Just the empty, cavernous room, shadows pooling in the corners. Shaking it off, I grabbed my sandwich and went to the living room, sinking into the plush leather couch. I turned on the massive flat screen, hoping to drown my anxiety in noise. But the feeling didn't leave. It only grew worse. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows deepening even as the flickering light of the TV played across them. When I finally tried to sleep, I kept hearing soft noises. The gentle swish of a door swinging, the faint scuff of footsteps on the hardwood. My logical brain insisted it was the old house settling, but the rest of me, my instincts screamed that something was off. I barely slept. The next morning, I resolved to check the entire house, even if it was just to prove to myself that nothing was wrong. I found nothing out of place. But when I passed the West Wing door, I stopped. There on the marble floor just in front of the door was a footprint. It was faint, but it was there, a smudge in the shape of a bare foot, the outline clear against the polished stone. My mouth went dry. I hadn't gone near the door. No one else was supposed to be in the house. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was sharing the space with someone, or something I couldn't see. That evening, I wandered the halls, unable to sit still. The family's art collection lined the corridors. Abstract paintings, delicate sculptures, and old, dusty portraits. But one painting in particular caught my eye. It was a huge canvas depicting the house itself, though from decades ago, with ivy creeping up its stone walls. What was unsettling was the tiny detail in one of the windows, a shadowy figure staring out. A chill coursed through me, and I stepped back, nearly tripping over my own feet. When night fell, the mansion transformed into a labyrinth of unsettling noises and shifting shadows. I was lying in bed, struggling to convince myself to sleep, when I heard a soft, metallic click from the hallway. I froze, every muscle tensed. It was unmistakable, the sound of a door unlocking. Heart thudding, I crept out of bed, gripping the nearest thing I could find, a heavy glass paperweight. The West Wing door stood ajar, a black void yawning into the off-limits area. I swallowed hard, my hands slick with sweat, and stepped closer, trying to peer into the darkness. The air spilling from the West Wing felt colder, almost damp. That's when I saw it. Faint outlines of objects, old medical equipment draped in dusty sheets. And there, lying in the center of the room, was something that made my breath catch. A series of photographs pinned to a corkboard, all taken within the house. Each photo depicted someone standing in a room, looking perfectly normal, except for one thing. A shadow always hovered behind them, obscured, almost like it was part of the room. But it was the last photograph that shattered the thin barrier between fear and panic. It was a picture of me, taken from behind while I stood in the kitchen making that sandwich. I stumbled backward, the world spinning, my mind screaming with the realization that someone had been there, watching me, within arm's reach. I ran from the West Wing, slamming the door shut and locking it. The rest of the night passed in a blur of adrenaline and terror, my ears straining for any noise, my eyes flickering to every shifting shadow. By dawn, I was gone, my bags hastily packed, my hands still shaking. The family paid me, no questions asked, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the house knew I had trespassed, that its secrets had come too close to touching me. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I still feel watched. I wonder if it ever really let me go. I was never a superstitious person. My life was full of routines, of predictability. Wake up, shower, grab coffee, and slog through work. But that morning was different. As I settled into my office chair, bleary-eyed and yawning, I saw it. a bright yellow sticky note clinging to the side of my monitor. Its message was simple yet chilling. 10 days left. I frowned, peeling it off and examining it. No signature, no hint of who might have left it. Some office prank, I figured, a harmless joke to break the monotony. I tossed it into the trash, thinking little of it. But throughout the day, I found myself glancing nervously at the trash can, the note's cryptic warning scratching at the back of my mind like a dull itch. The next morning, a fresh sticky note awaited me. 9 days left. My stomach twisted. It felt more deliberate now, unsettling. I scoured the office, asking around, but no one admitted to the prank. My colleagues laughed it off, their shrugs and grins only amplifying my unease. Day by day, the countdown continued. 8 days left. 7 days left. Each note was placed perfectly, always in my workstation, waiting for me to arrive. I checked the building's security footage, only to be told by the IT department that the cameras facing my desk area had mysteriously glitched out overnight. The feeling of being targeted, of being watched, settled over me like a dense fog. By the time I found the note that read 6 days left, things started happening. Small, unnerving incidents. My car wouldn't start, its engine stuttering and groaning until I finally gave up and took a cab. Doors in my apartment I knew I had locked were inexplicably ajar when I got home. The worst part was the sense of something lurking just beyond the edge of my awareness, a persistent itch that wouldn't go away. 5 days left. I woke up to my front door standing wide open. Cold morning air spilled into my living room, and the realization that someone could have been inside, could still be inside, made my hands shake. I grabbed a kitchen knife and searched every room, every closet. Nothing. But the unease refused to fade. 4 days left. My phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was garbled, distorted, saying something I couldn't understand before the line went dead. The text began shortly after. Descriptions of what I was wearing, of the coffee shop I'd stopped at, of the route I took to work. I reported everything to the police, but without any tangible evidence. They seemed unconvinced. Their half-hearted promises to look into it did nothing to quell the gnawing dread. The world around me felt off-kilter, like a puzzle with pieces that wouldn't fit. 3 days left. I stayed up that night, lights on, knife by my side. Every creak, every sigh of the old building sent adrenaline coursing through my veins. Sleep became a distant memory, replaced by exhaustion and paranoia. 2 days left. The driver who nearly ran me off the road was never caught. A black SUV, windows tinted, had swerved into my lane, pushing me toward the guardrail before speeding off. The cops asked if I had enemies. I had none. I was just an ordinary guy. So why me? 1 day left. I barely left my apartment, opting to work from home. My phone rang endlessly, anonymous calls that I refused to answer. Fear gripped me so tightly that my chest ached. Every shadow seemed to harbor a threat. Every knock at the door made me jump. By sunset, I was shaking, the countdown clawing at my sanity. Then, the final day arrived. I found the note on my kitchen counter. 0 days left. My breath came in short gasps, my vision swimming. What did it mean? Was something about to happen? I sat there, waiting, every second an eternity, my ears straining for any sound that could signal danger. Hours crawled by, and nothing happened. The silence became suffocating, pressing in on all sides. Then, at exactly midnight, my phone buzzed. A single text message. Hands trembling, I opened it. You've been chosen. Welcome. The screen went dark, and suddenly all the lights in my apartment cut out, plunging me into blackness. I heard it then, soft, deliberate footsteps approaching from the hallway, stopping just outside my door. The knob twisted, and I held my breath, paralyzed with a fear I'd never known. But the door didn't open. The footsteps moved away, retreating into the quiet of the night. I was left there, shivering, wondering if the countdown had truly ended, or if this was just the beginning. Working as a park ranger in a sprawling national park was a dream job, at least for someone who craved solitude and nature. Most days, The forest was alive with the hum of insects, the rustling of leaves, and the distant babble of a stream meandering through the woods. But every morning for the past week, a lone visitor had disturbed the tranquil routine, and his presence left a growing unease in its wake. The first morning I noticed him, he was standing by a massive pine tree, perfectly still, staring into the woods. His back was to me, shoulders squared, head tilted slightly forward. I thought maybe he was a hiker or a birdwatcher. But when I called out, his only response was a subtle shift, the slightest twitch of his head, as if he'd heard but decided not to turn around. I let it go, but something about the encounter left a tightness in my chest. The second day, he was there again. Same spot, same stance. The morning sun streamed through the canopy, painting golden patches on the forest floor, but the air felt heavier somehow, laced with a tension I couldn't shake. I tried a different approach, walking up from the side to get a better look. But before I could reach him, he melted into the woods, disappearing so swiftly it felt almost unnatural. My colleagues brushed off my concerns, saying it was probably just a harmless camper or a local who enjoyed the park. But I couldn't let it go. The forest had always felt like a living thing to me, and his presence was a discordant note in its otherwise perfect harmony. By the third morning, I was ready. I arrived early, heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and dread. Sure enough, there he was standing by that same tree, his gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. I crept closer, moving as quietly as I could, until I was just a few feet away. This time, I could see more. His clothes were worn, frayed at the edges, and he was shoeless, his feet caked in mud. "Hey!" I called, trying to sound authoritative despite the way my voice cracked. He didn't flinch or turn, but he spoke. His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't used it in years. "It's coming," he whispered. The way he said it sent a shiver coursing down my spine, each word heavy with something that felt uncomfortably like truth. "What's coming?" I asked, but he was gone before I could get an answer, his departure silent and sudden. I was left standing there, feeling like the forest had exhaled a sigh of relief the moment he vanished. The next morning, he wasn't there. I should have felt relieved, but instead, I felt a gnawing worry. I spent the day patrolling his usual area, half expecting him to materialize from the shadows. The park was unusually quiet, a thick silence broken only by the rustle of wind through the branches. The emptiness felt deliberate, like the woods were holding their breath, waiting. On the fifth morning, I found an abandoned campsite not far from the tree. The fire pit was cold, and the only remnants were scattered belongings: a torn sleeping bag, a dented canteen, and a notebook half buried under pine needles. My hands shook as I opened the notebook, the pages brittle and stained with something dark, almost like rust. Inside were frantic scrawled notes. "It moves in the shadows. Don't look into the eyes. I've made a mistake." Each entry felt like a confession, a record of fear that had taken root and spread. I flipped to the last page, and my stomach twisted. The final words were bold, the pen pressing deep into the paper. Still out there. Still waiting. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the notebook slipping from my fingers, landing softly on the forest floor. The wind picked up, whispering through the branches, and for the first time, the forest didn't feel like my home. It felt like a labyrinth, full of corners and crevices where something might be lurking. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of my cabin, every groan of the wind, made me jump, my pulse racing. The next morning, I returned to the tree, hoping, dreading, to see him again. But instead, there was something else. Fresh claw marks gouged deep into the bark, as if something had tried to tear the tree apart. The sight made my breath catch, and I stumbled back, heart pounding. The man never returned, but the park didn't feel the same. The woods were no longer a sanctuary, but a place brimming with secrets, as if the trees had witnessed something unspeakable and were now keeping it hidden. Every so often, I think I hear footsteps that aren't mine, or catch a glimpse of a shadow moving where no shadow should be. And I still wonder about his final warning. It's coming. Whatever he meant, I've come to understand one thing. Some warnings aren't meant to be ignored. Being an artist isn't easy. Rent doesn't pay itself, and passion doesn't always translate into income. That's why, when I received a series of anonymous donations that began funding my projects, it felt like a miracle. The money came in large amounts, enough to cover not just materials but also studio time, exhibition fees, and more. The benefactor remained a mystery, but I was too grateful to question it. The first check came in a plain envelope with no return address. I thought it was a one-time thing, but then another arrived, and another. I started to feel uneasy, the kind of discomfort that simmers quietly in the background. What kind of person would give so much without revealing themselves? But whenever doubt crept in, the financial security it provided quieted those fears. Weeks passed, and my art flourished. My work was being displayed in places I'd only dreamed of, my pieces drawing crowds and whispers of admiration. But along with the success came the first strange request. An email arrived from an untraceable address. Incorporate the symbol into your next piece. Attached was a simple design, a circle with a jagged line cutting through it. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold sweat form on the back of my neck. The request felt wrong, invasive, like someone had reached into my mind and left a mark. But the money kept flowing, and the pressure to keep producing mounted. Reluctantly, I added the symbol into a corner of my latest piece, small and subtle, barely noticeable. When that piece sold immediately, the unease deepened. The next email came with more instructions, more designs to hide within my work. I tried to rationalize it. Artists had patrons all the time, right? Maybe this was just some eccentric person who wanted to play a part in the creative process. But deep down, I knew this was something else. It wasn't until I received photos of my family that fear bloomed fully. The pictures were candid, taken from odd angles. My sister walking her dog, my parents sitting on their porch, my nephew playing in the yard. Each photo had a note. Keep creating. We're all watching. My hands shook as I held the images, and for the first time, I realized I might be trapped. I tried going to the police, but what could I say? No one had hurt me. No one had committed a crime. Technically, the officers listened politely, but exchanged looks that said they thought I was being paranoid. I left the station feeling more isolated than ever. Determined to put an end to this, I stopped responding to the requests. I refused to incorporate any more symbols. But the consequences were immediate. Accidents started happening around me. A car sped through a red light and nearly clipped me. A brick fell from a construction site, barely missing me by inches. Each incident left me rattled, breathless, and wondering if they were coincidences or warnings. Then, the final message arrived. It was different, no longer just instructions. This time, it was a demand, one last piece. The gallery on 9th Street. Make it memorable. There was a list of symbols, more intricate and ominous, each with notes about where to place them. The attached payment was a staggering amount, enough to keep me afloat for years. But I couldn't do it. The thought of being manipulated, of letting this invisible force dictate my art, made me feel like my work was tainted. I spent a sleepless night in my studio, staring at a blank canvas. That's when I noticed something chilling. The symbols I had incorporated into past pieces. They had appeared in subtle ways all around my studio, scratched into the wood floors, etched faintly on the window panes. My breath caught, and I stumbled back, heart pounding. It was as if the symbols had taken on a life of their own, embedded not just in my art, but in my surroundings. Desperation clawed at me, and I made a choice. I'd leave the city, abandon my art, start fresh somewhere new. The next day, as I was packing my things, my phone buzzed. A new message. You can't run. You're ours now. Attached was a video. I almost dropped the phone when I saw what it showed. My parents' front door, shot from what looked like a security camera. The timestamp was just minutes old. Someone was there, watching them, right at that moment. I froze, realizing escape was never an option. They had woven themselves into every part of my life, a web I'd unwittingly helped construct. The only thing left to do was finish the piece. As I stood there, paintbrush trembling in my hand, I felt like a puppet, my strings pulled by an unseen hand. The symbols went onto the canvas, one by one, as dread pooled in my gut. Each brushstroke felt like a step towards something I couldn't comprehend, something dark and waiting. And with every stroke, I wondered, would this be my last piece? Or had I just set something far worse in motion? The university library was my sanctuary, a place of dusty tomes, quiet whispers, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. I often stayed late, surrounded by the comforting walls of books that promised knowledge and escape. But on that particular evening, as rain lashed against the windows and the building emptied, my refuge turned into something far more sinister. I was in the back, hunting down a rare book on the history of philosophy, when I noticed it. A heavy wooden door tucked into the shadows, labeled restricted access. I'd walked these aisles countless times, but had never noticed it before. Curiosity prickled at me, and without thinking, I stepped closer. The metal handle was cold, and a small brass sign beneath the main plaque bore a warning. Authorized personnel only. But the door was slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. Against my better judgment, I pushed it open, and the hinges creaked, echoing through the empty library. The room beyond was dim, filled with towering shelves that looked older than the rest of the building. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of aged paper and something else, something almost metallic. I pulled out my phone, using the flashlight to illuminate the rows. Books in this section weren't labeled or organized, just bound volumes with titles so faded they were almost unreadable. I ran my fingers along the spines, feeling a growing sense of unease. It wasn't the thrill of breaking a rule. It was deeper, instinctive, like I was somewhere I absolutely shouldn't be. Near the back, a glass case caught my attention. Inside were a series of journals, each meticulously arranged. One of them lay open, and I leaned in to read the handwritten notes. The words were frantic, written in shaky script. They know. They always know. If you read this, they'll come for you. My throat tightened, and I pulled away, the chill of dread creeping into my bones. I wanted to leave, to forget I'd ever stumbled into this forgotten part of the library. But as I turned, something in the shadows shifted. A soft rustling sound, like fabric brushing against stone. I spun around, heart racing, but saw only shelves and the same suffocating darkness. The noise had come from somewhere deeper in the room. My hands were slick with sweat as I made my way back to the door. Every step I took seemed to echo unnaturally loud, and I kept expecting something to reach out from the shadows and grab me. When I finally pushed the door open and stumbled into the main library, the relief was overwhelming. I gulped down air, feeling ridiculous for being so jumpy. But the unease didn't leave. Even as I packed up my things, the library seemed different. The shadows deeper, the corners darker. My mind raced, replaying the words from the journal, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The next day, things took a stranger turn. I was heading to class when someone tapped my shoulder. It was a librarian, one I'd seen in passing, but had never spoken to. She stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You shouldn't have gone in there," she whispered, her voice tight. Before I could respond, she was gone, disappearing into a crowd of students. The rest of the day passed in a blur, anxiety gnawing at my nerves. By nightfall, I found myself back at the library, this time out of fear, not curiosity. I needed answers, an explanation that could dissolve the rising sense of dread. But as I walked through the aisles, I realized something horrifying. The restricted access door was gone. Where it had been, there was now only an unbroken wall of bookshelves. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was losing it. But no matter how hard I searched, the door was simply gone, as if it had never been there. My fingers trembled as I backed away, bumping into a student who looked up at me with wide, haunted eyes. "Did you read it?" he asked, his voice a brittle whisper. "The journals. Did you read them?" My mouth went dry, and I nodded. His face fell, and he grabbed my arm. "It'll follow you now. It follows all of us who've read too much." Before I could question him, he hurried off, leaving me standing there, stunned and cold. I didn't go back to the library after that, but the feeling of being watched followed me everywhere. In my apartment, The shadows seemed to move on their own. Footsteps echoed in the hallways at odd hours, and I began waking up to my books rearranged, pages dog-eared to ominous passages. One night, I awoke to find a single page from one of those journals lying on my chest, written across it in that same shaky hand. You can't unread what you know. The words felt like a curse, a promise that knowledge came with a price I hadn't understood until it was too late. And now, wherever I go, I can't shake the feeling that something is there, watching, waiting for me to read more, to know more. And I wonder if one day I'll make the mistake of seeking answers again. And if that day, the shadows will finally close in. Friends, please support my channel by subscribing and liking it. You are the best.